Hello and welcome back to Capital Cosm. In today's episode, I have Mr. Chris Keefer back on the show. Been really looking forward to having Chris on. He's been traveling the globe, most recently having come back from COP28. So, really interested to hear his take on how the global narrative is shifting on nuclear power. With that said, Chris, for those who may have not seen the first interview between you and Chris, go ahead and give the audience a brief intro on who you are.
Practicing in Toronto, Ontario, about 5 years ago, with the birth of my son, I got very interested in climate change and trying to understand what some of the highest yield responses would be. That led me pretty quickly to nuclear power. We have a 60% nuclear powered grid here, and essentially have achieved that holy grail of a deeply decarbonized grid. And I found that there was a lot of myths that needed to be busted about it. And I've always been a champion of the underdog in my previous humanitarian activism, and decided to take this on. So I started a podcast called the Decouple Podcast, in which I've interviewed over, I think, 220 experts at this point, as a tool to educate myself. That's got quite a listenership now in a lot of policy think tanks and circles. And I also founded Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and I've been the president of that organization for the last 3 years. And we've had some major policy wins here in Canada with the federal government, flipping from a capture by the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace towards really checking all the boxes of our wish list. So it's been a pretty exciting 3 years. And as you mentioned, just got back from COP28 in Dubai. It's my third COP that I've been to. These sort of bizarre conferences where tens and tens of thousands of people gather to argue over some wording in a final declaration. Should we say phase out, phase down, move towards, et cetera, all this diplomatic language. It seems like a lot of pageantry. Climate Versailles is I think what I was calling it last year, climate Burning Man this year. Dubai is an extraordinary oil oasis in the desert, crazy architecture, and the COP itself was no exception to sort of that theme this year. So it's been an interesting few years, and yeah, COP28 was, I'm sure I'll have lots to talk about in terms of digesting that.
Yeah, so COP Versailles, if you haven't trademarked that, I'm probably going to start stealing that from this point forward, just FYI. Before we start to dig in about some of the new developments in COP28, I noticed a tweet from you. You kind of alluded to the amount of progress that has been made over the last 2 years in COP28. 2 years ago, you had this march for nuclear power, and they had like this very propagandized, view of it. Kind of run us down, like, what did you see this year versus, let's say, a couple years ago? How was the sentiment narrative changed?
Yeah, so nuclear has been showing up at COP. Largely this group, Nuclear for Climate, which are a bunch of young professionals generally in the industry who go and on a volunteer basis and hand out pamphlets and have conversations. And that's been going on for a number of years. Back in Poland, I wasn't at this COP, but a number of pro-nuclear advocates were actually assaulted. This is a very emotional issue, particularly in Europe. The Germans tend to get pretty nasty. I thought that was very interesting. Germans misbehaving in Poland, beating up Polish pro-nuclear advocates. It just seemed like they should maybe think twice about misbehaving in Poland. But, I first went to COP in Glasgow. That was 2021. Nuclear was sort of never really on the formal agenda. It didn't make it into any of the formal statements. And what changed this year is the host country of the United Arab Emirates are just in the process of bringing on the fourth of their large reactors at the Baraka complex. This plant currently provides about 4,200 megawatts and will be up to 5,600 megawatts, or about 25% of their electricity grid. Constructed from desert sand right into this monumental series of reactor domes, again in about 12 years. And I had the chance to actually go and visit that site and do a red zone tour, so kind of get inside the plant and talk to a lot of people that work there. So in any case, at this COP, the United Arab Emirates, the Emirati Nuclear Energy Corporation, they did a lot of diplomatic efforts to get nuclear more on the agenda, and indeed they organized actually ended up being about 25 nations by the end of it to endorse a tripling of nuclear energy capacity by 2050. Very, very ambitious goal. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but that was an absolute sea change. We've never seen anything like that at COP. And in the final so-called stock take, and final sort of declaration of COP, nuclear was a part of the framing of the response to climate change. So as obvious as that is, being literally the lowest life cycle energy source in terms of carbon emissions, it's taken us to 2023 to finally have that recognized, and again, championed by a number of governments around the world.
Yeah, hopefully not too little too soon, right? Especially since we kind of like look down the barrel of this energy crisis, less crunch over the last several years and years to come as well. So a tripling in nuclear power adoption to the point over the next 25 some odd years to 2050. And you kind of feel that that's kind of a little over ambitious. Do we really have a choice, though, in the matter not to adopt nuclear power to that extent?
Listen, I mean, nuclear gets deployed because of pragmatic reasons, primarily energy security. And a number of countries around the world accidentally decarbonized. So France, for instance, in the face of the 1973 OPEC crisis, France doesn't have coal. They don't have gas. Oil used to be dirt cheap before the Arab nations said, you know what, this we're going to form a bit of a cartel here and decide on the prices and get what we feel we deserve out of this commodity. And so at that point in the 60s and early 70s, oil was cheap enough that it was a significant part of France's power generation. After the OPEC crisis, when the price of oil went up through the roof, the French were in a crisis. They didn't have coal, they didn't have natural gas, and they could no longer afford to burn oil. They needed it for their automotive fleet, so they went big on nuclear. So that was an energy security play. Again, had this effect of accidentally decarbonizing their economy while their economy continued to grow at 3-4% a year for a number of decades afterwards. So it gives you a little hint of how powerful nuclear energy is, that it can accomplish a great sort of environmental goal while continuing to allow economic growth, et cetera. Here where I'm at in Ontario, similar story. We don't have coal, we don't have gas. We were importing coal from the US. That OPEC crisis, you're going to hear, it's a bit of a theme. A knock-on effect of the price of oil going up was the price of coal doubled in North America, and that really hurt our economics and our coal fleet. And we had this CANDU technology, this nuclear technology we've been working on, and we deployed very quickly 22 reactors over 22 years to meet that challenge of energy security. So, when I hear climate change as a driver for nuclear deployment, I'm a little skeptical. Nuclear is incredibly challenging. It takes an enormous amount of coordination, institutional excellence, human excellence, and just, coordination right down from kind of the national to the state level, bringing in industry, having sort of one team, one goal, and pulling it off. You don't tend to do those things for things that are not really pragmatic sort of life or death situations. And a lot of people would argue that climate change is that, but I don't feel that's to be a strong enough motivator. We will do a lot of virtue signaling around the edges. We'll ban plastic straws or single-use plastics. We'll do some subsidies for wind and solar projects. But something as challenging as nuclear, I think it happens for more pragmatic reasons. And that's what Europe is kind of the El Dorado of new nuclear, because obviously of the Russian gas cutoff and the uneasy relationship of those former Warsaw Pact or Soviet bloc countries with a reliance on Russian gas. They, I think, are going to be where we see a lot of new nuclear deployed.
Yeah. So has there been a big component of nuclear energy is obviously uranium based, but we're also starting to hear rumblings of very early stages of thorium molten salt reactors. Was there any talk about that at COP28 or no? Was that included as part of that 2050 goal?
No, in fact, no. Over the last 10 or 15 years in the Western world, we've really not been building much nuclear. You have the Vogtle plant, units 1 and 2. Unit 1 came online last year. Unit 2 should come online this year. We have a scattering of a few large plants built in Europe. Again, all of these at least 10 years behind schedule, double, triple over budget. It's not been a pleasant few years. And at the same time, we've had a lot of excitement about so-called advanced nuclear. So The typical reactor technologies use water as a moderator and a coolant. And they are what have proliferated around the world and form the basis of the commercial nuclear reactor fleets around the world. There's been some side projects. There was the Chernobyl style reactor, the RBMK. We don't build those anymore for obvious reasons. There was a gas cooled reactor lineage famously deployed in the UK, but those have sort of fallen by the wayside. So we have basically three water-based technologies. One is the Canadian heavy water pressurized water reactor, and then you have the American pressurized and boiling water reactors. As I was saying, in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of excitement. What if we do a sodium fast reactor? What if we do molten salt reactors? What if we do high temperature gas reactors? And these are, what I'll call back to the future reactors. They've all been experimented with. There's been significant work done in national labs on these technologies, but they are not commercially mature. In this, last 10, 15 years where we've not been building, we've had a lot of time to imagine and sort of fantasize and not have things tested by actual deployment, by actual kind of cost overruns, or by, running plants not on simulators, but in the real world and discovering problems. It took about 20, 30 years for our traditional water-based fleets to achieve, the high capacity factors, that reliability that nuclear is renowned for now. In the 60s and 70s, before 3 Mile Island, capacity factors, you were lucky to get above 50%. Now nuclear is online 90 to 95% of the time. These new concepts, promising as they are, just need more time in the national labs to be matured. And so, that was not a serious point of discussion. And indeed, I think we're seeing a real shift back towards, okay, let's keep it simple, stupid, focus on what we know how to do really well, and, develop some of these so-called advanced reactor concepts, as Russia and China are doing on the margins of a very large, active, traditional nuclear industry, which I think is, pretty sensible.
Yeah. So you mentioned China there. They're building out hundreds of new reactors as we speak right now. And I believe there's one or two, like a few thorium molten salt reactors too. So what are they doing differently from us? I also noticed another tweet from you. China recently deployed what was it called? A light water reactor,
high temperature gas reactor.
High temperature reactor. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of explain what the significance of that is.
Yeah, so China, you're right. Right now there's 60 reactors under construction around the world. China, Russia, and India are building 46 of those. There's one under construction in the US, 3 in America, 4 in Europe, finishing one in the UAE. So you get a sense of, who's actually building. Interestingly enough, Russia, India, and China did not sign on to the agreement to triple nuclear energy. I mean, they're kind of doing it anyway, so maybe they didn't need to sign on, but that was kind of an interesting thing to kind of remark upon. China, the vast majority of their efforts are these gigawatt scale, these extremely large water-based nuclear power plants. They've sort of done a buffet lunch of sampling technologies from around the world, from the US, even from Canada, from France, and other places, and they've sort of settled in on a sort of standardized gigawatt scale reactor technology, and that's the bread and butter of their fleet and of their future. But once you have a healthy, dynamic, vibrant nuclear industry, you can afford to sort of play around on the margins and look at other use cases for nuclear. So right now, nuclear's used basically exclusively for electricity. There's some applications in district heating, sort of low-grade temperature, or low-grade process heat. One of the challenges with decarbonization is the need to replace medium and high-grade process heat that's required for endless industrial processes and the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. So a high-temperature gas reactor gives you, working fluids of 500-600 degrees Celsius that you can use for a lot of industrial processes. And so there's an interest in looking at that. This is a technology developed in Germany and then South Africa. Still, pretty early days. When we talk about, the experience we have with nuclear, you can think about our water-based fleets. We're at about 17,000, 18,000 years of reactor years of operation. So we've done a ton of troubleshooting and we've really perfected our operations. Molten salt reactors, we have about 3 reactor years of experience. And high temperature gas reactors, I'm going to hazard a guess, maybe 20 or 30 years of experience. So that gives you a sense again of the kind of technical and commercial maturity of these technologies. China is certainly exploring and playing around, but this is not the basis of their nuclear fleets moving forward. They're very much focused on the traditional water-cooled moderated reactors, but exploring some use cases for process heat, for instance, on the side.
I mean, what are they doing differently from us here in the West that they've been able to get on the ball much more readily?
Well, here's the dirty secret about nuclear. It requires some degree of vertical integration, some degree of what's the French call dirigisme or dirigiste kind of economic policy, which means that the state takes some kind of role. This is a strategic technology. Obviously, there's proliferation concerns. It's a dual-use technology. There's weapons application of nuclear. You need to be careful in terms of the feedstock and the waste stream of nuclear, et cetera. And it tends to benefit from a careful coordination. And what we see in places like China, Russia, South Korea, or the United Arab Emirates is really strategic thinking about the sector, an alignment of interests that has more of a sort of national goal at its heart. And this is where we're seeing these deployments of standardized reactor technology and similar design being deployed over and over again, usually a number of them on the same site, to take advantage of all of the learning that can accrue. In the West, the nuclear ecosystem is a lot more complicated. There are a number of different companies and entities, all with fiduciary duties to different shareholders. And for instance, right now in Europe and America, there's a dependence on Russia for about 25% of the enrichment services that we need to run our fleets. This is there's a long, sordid history as to how we've got to this place. But one would think, given Putin's power politics with gas in Europe, that that might give some thought to making sure that you're not dependent on foreign adversary for the enrichment services you need to keep 1 in 20 American houses and businesses the lights on. And there's sort of a failure, I think, this is kind of emblematic of a failure in the US to have a much more kind of coordinated ecosystem. People will say, well, the original US build out wasn't sort of state driven, but it was driven by large utilities, which in a sense almost like act as a state. They've got a rate base that might be analogous to a tax base. These were very large entities capable of marshaling a lot of low cost capital, of distributing risk again onto that rate base, sometimes with consequences. Nuclear is one of the only things that's ever bankrupted a large utility. But basically, yeah, I mean, if I'm trying to sum it up, I think why we're floundering in the West is in part because of neoliberalism, in terms of this idea that there's government should be small and not so much involved in terms of national industrial policy, and nuclear really requires that. So that's kind of in a nutshell my thesis as to why we're seeing these countries deploying quickly. And if the U.S. decides, and it doesn't need to, I mean, right now natural gas prices went up. The U.S. is moving in towards becoming an LNG exporter, but also there's almost a glut of liquefied natural gas in the market right now. There's plenty of gas in the U.S. to take care of power generation for quite a while into the future. There's not again, like a pragmatic energy security need for nuclear in the U.S. We're seeing a resurging interest because of climate on the one hand, and I guess also because there's probably some understanding that gas prices did go unexpectedly high and made nuclear more economic recently. So complicated reasons. I would just say that the U.S. would be wise to at least maybe be a little less arrogant when it comes to nuclear, and say, okay, how are our adversaries or even friendly countries like South Korea capable of doing this? Maybe there's lessons to be learned. My fear is that the sociopolitical models in the U.S. are just not conducive in the end to fast, wide-scale deployments of nuclear.
Isn't there also an element of regulatory capture by fossil fuel industries as well? I saw you tweet the other day, the coal industry had lobbied to remove subsidies for the nuclear power industry back in the 60s, not even the 90s, all the way back in the 60s. So doesn't that have to do with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, very, very early on, back in even the 30s and 40s, when there was excitement about, this was, really before we'd even had a controlled chain reaction that occurred in 1942. But in the 30s, there would be, gatherings of the World Petroleum Conference. And one of Albert Einstein's friends, Art Eddington, went there and said, "You guys are cooked. Your days are done. Like I've analyzed the sun. It's not a ball of fire. That's a fusion reaction. And fission is on the horizon, and it's going to be, our new great source of energy. We're going to eclipse the use of oil and gas and coal." And so certainly at that point, there's, I think, a fairly well documented response by the Rockefeller Foundation to pursue and fund particularly studies in genetics, which I think grossly amplified the risks of radiation. So I think there's compelling arguments there. There's also there have been campaigns in Australia, for instance, from the coal industry saying, nuclear threatens coal jobs. And it does. So there's been those sort of conspiracies, if we want to call them that. I wouldn't say that's the main factor. There's so many things that have held back nuclear, and certainly it's one of them. And the fossil fuel industry, is powerful and well capitalized, but I wouldn't say that's a dominant force in this day and age.
Right. So, I mean, if you look at a chart of nuclear adoption in the United States, stretching all the way out to the 90s, for example, you'll see a steady move up in adoption. And all of a sudden, it just flatlines, like the 90s forward. What's kind of going on there? I'll look for the graph, in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people think that the 3 Mile Island is what killed nuclear in the States. The order books were overflowing in the 60s and 70s. And while no new nuclear sites, were planned after 3 Mile Island, there was a lot of inertia in the system. I'd say, in the mid 70s already, the order books were drying up, but enough sites had been planned and, construction had begun that we still saw kind of an inertia effect. So for instance, Diablo Canyon, that was planned prior to 3 Mile Island, but was deployed I believe in the 80s, came online in the late 80s. So in terms of why we stopped building nuclear, again, many, many factors at play there. I'd say a dominant one is demand growth dried up. This was the forecast from the utilities in the 70s were that, we'd be using 3 or 4 times more electricity than we actually are now. And so a lot of plans were made around that. But, I probably for a number of reasons related to the oil crisis, to recession, and just to the fact that we got a little more efficient in our electricity use and satiated demand. You're not going to spend billions and billions of dollars on a capital intensive project if you're not sure you have the customers for the kilowatt hours at the other end. And so, for about 3 or 4 decades, we haven't really seen strong demand growth. That's starting to change now, and partially because of climate-related electrification, partially because of reshoring of strategic industries. We accepted this Francis Fukuyama-like vision of the world, the end of history, that everywhere we're going to move towards the ultimate form of human governments, which is, liberal democracies, and peace would reign over the world because democracies don't tend to wage war on democracies, and kumbaya. And here we are, after the Russian invasion, very much back in a multipolar world. I don't know if it's fair to say it's a new Cold War, but certainly with globalization, we offshored a lot of our heavy industry and strategic industries, and we're feeling in the West a need to sort of pull that back. That requires a lot more power generation. So part of the reason that power demand stagnated in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s is we basically moved a lot of heavy industry overseas. That power growth occurred over there. And now we're wanting to be able to power those industries back home. And that's, again, I think part of what's leading to a nuclear revival in the West right now, certainly much more than climate change.
Yeah. So if you look at this chart here, you've got the North America here in blue, and you can pretty much see the stagnation somewhere around the 2000s up until today. But then you also see that same level of stagnation, no matter which part of the world you look at. So, what's going on? What went on outside of the United States to also kind of put a pause on things?
Well, something that's really interesting about this graph, actually. So this is looking at terawatt hours. So this is electricity produced. As you're saying, the U.S. fleet really, we didn't start adding new nuclear reactors, but after 3 Mile Island, we really got our act together on operations. So a lot of best practices were being shared. There's a realization that an injury to one was an injury to all. And, 3 Mile Island, there were, a variety of reasons for why that accident occurred, but it was felt really that it was primarily an operations issue. And so we saw the capacity factors of nuclear plants leap from 50-60% up into the 90s and mid 90s we see now. So without even building new reactors, it's almost as if we added another 1/3 of a fleet of new reactors, but just because we were operating them better. So that's kind of an interesting counterfactual. In terms of you can see there in the 2013 or 2011 area, we can see the drop off post Fukushima. But Asia's bouncing up pretty quickly there. China will soon eclipse France and then the US for the most nuclear reactors in the world. The US fleet was around, I believe, 104, and we're into the high 90s now. And I believe China's going to surpass us by the 2030s. And they have plans to really continue to grow. And these are pragmatic plans. Most of the coal in China is in the northwest, and a lot of the population is in the coastal southeast. I've heard that around 50% of rail traffic in China is simply moving coal across the country to the load centers in the southeast, and so that's where a lot of the nuclear construction is occurring. Again, just to relieve some of that rail traffic. It's not that they're short on coal particularly, but it's in the wrong place in terms of the country. But again, it's not that nuclear is replacing coal or replacing other forms of power generation. Everything is growing in China right now. And that's a little bit, what makes me a little more sober. And, I said earlier on when you said about the tripling of nuclear energy, it's a great aspirational goal. I doubt that we'll see it happen. And that's just because, nuclear is complicated. It takes serious marshaling of the very best people, the most skilled engineers, skilled tradespeople. It takes institutional excellence. And that takes a while. It can be done well. And nuclear represents the fastest additions of clean power per capita around the world. We've seen that over and over again in France, Sweden, Ontario even. So it can happen quite quickly. But even with the explosion in renewables, it's not significantly displacing fossil fuels. It's just sort of adding on top of them. So, I'm maybe in a little bit of a pessimistic mood coming out of COP, or more of a realistic mood, but that's sort of my best effort at trying to explain this graph for you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the explanation and interpretation of this chart here. I could definitely see Asia moving more on the right. They've actually hit an all-time high when it comes to output of nuclear power. So there's definitely a trend there. Before we move away from COP28, any other takeaways, insights that you want to share with the audience from that conference?